if you grew up in America, Psalm 23 is a very, very familiar verse. It's a verse that you hear a lot, over and over and over again. You hear it, it's very popular among Christians, of course. Christians will read it at funerals, they'll put it on their gravestones. It's a very popular tattoo to get on your body, this Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. I still remember the day after 9/11, President Bush appeared on national television to address the entire nation. And he read this very long speech, but I remember clearly the words that he closed with, because he closed with the words of verse 4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. You are with me. And we hear it in many other places as well. Another famous use of Psalm 23 was a movie, a very old movie from the 80s. It was a Western movie, a Western movie with cowboys shooting. And it was called Pale Rider with Clint Eastwood. Do we know Clint Eastwood? Right? Young, 멋있는 Clint Eastwood, not 할아버지 Clint Eastwood, but young, 멋있는 Clint Eastwood came out in this movie, Pale Rider, and it starred him as the hero cowboy riding in on his horse. And his character was known as the preacher. But the person who reads Psalm 23 in this movie is not Clint Eastwood's character, the preacher. It is actually a young girl named Megan. Megan's town, her village, is attacked by the villains, the bad guys of the movie. And there's a huge gunfight, horses running around everywhere. And in the middle of it all, her dog is shot and killed. And so Megan is filled with sorrow. She is filled with grief and anguish for the loss of her beloved friend, her dog. And as she buries her dog with tears in her eyes and trembling in her voice, she reads the words of Psalm 23, these familiar words. But she puts her own twist on it. She puts a little twist on it. And so she makes this psalm, she rewrites it as her personal prayer lifted up to God. She reads, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. But I do want. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. But they killed my dog. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. But I am afraid. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. But we need a miracle. Thy loving kindness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, if you exist, God. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. But first, I'd like to get more out of this life. If you don't help us, we're all going to die. Please, we need just one miracle." And so she mixes her words of grief, hope, and despair in with these words of King David. And some would interpret Megan's prayer, her mixing of her own words into Psalm 23 as lacking in faith, having a weak faith, or maybe even questioning God. How dare you question God in this time? Just read Psalm 23, that's all you need. Don't question God. But I think Megan, this young girl, understood the heart of David's message. Because this psalm is not a psalm for the dead. It is not a psalm to send them off into the next life. It is a psalm for the living. A psalm to give us comfort while we are living here in this life. It is not a psalm for the safe and the secure, people who have everything they need already, to remind them of how well they have it, how good everything is. It is a psalm for those who are in danger. It is a psalm for those who feel unsure, insecure of what comes next, to remind them that God is with them during this time. that God truly is their shepherd, even in the worst of times. It is a psalm for the living, not for the dead. It is a psalm for the suffering, not for the whole. It is a psalm for the brokenhearted and the oppressed, the needy and the lost. We know that Jesus spoke his parable of the lost sheep and told us that we are all sinners in need of a shepherd, that we are lost sheep in need of a Savior. And the image that David is using here, the shepherd, God as a shepherd, is so important. Because David could have said that God was a mighty emperor, that God was a noble king. And David was someone who had been a shepherd, but had also experienced being a king. So he fully knew both sides. He could have said that God was a king. He could have written that God spoke the entire universe into creation from just one word of his lips. That was the power that he had. That the wind and the waves obeyed his every command. He could have reminded his audience that God held all power. That God had power over the land, the crops that provided them with food to eat, and water that provided them with life. He could have said all these things. He could have said, God is my king. He could have said, God is my master. God is my teacher. God is my owner. But he said, God is my shepherd. A very different title. And the reason this is important is because the role of a shepherd, who a shepherd actually is, has a lot of meaning. And of course, on the base level, on the surface, we all know that the shepherd takes care of their sheep, right? The shepherd takes care of the sheep. The shepherd protects them, gives them food, gives them water, guides them, protects them. The shepherd takes care of their sheep. But we have to consider the social aspect of being a shepherd. Not just the relationship between shepherd and sheep, but the relationship between shepherd and society. Because being a shepherd was a very lowly occupation. It was not something that people wanted to do. It was not something that people studied to become. No one well-educated, no one born into a wealthy family, the son of a rich man, would never become a shepherd. It was dirty work. Everyone else looked down upon shepherds at that time. A shepherd would never be a good candidate for a future husband, a future son-in-law, right? A shepherd was not desirable. A shepherd was not what someone wanted to be. And we know that David was not unaware of this stigma surrounding shepherds because David knew better than anyone. David was a shepherd. David was a king who had once been a shepherd. So David knew. David spent his early years as a shepherd himself. He had been in that dirt. He had chased around those little sheep. And even in this, we can see just how low of a position a shepherd actually is, because David was a shepherd. And David was the youngest of his many brothers. It tells us Jesse was the father of Eliab, his firstborn. The second was Abinadab. The third Shemaiah. The fourth Nethanel. The fifth Radai. The sixth Ozem. And the seventh David. Other records show that David was actually the eighth son. But David, no matter what, was the youngest. He was the youngest. He was the last on this list. He was the 막내, 꼬맹이, little David. In ancient Israel, we know there was a custom that the firstborn son meant everything to the family. The firstborn son was the heir. The firstborn son was the one who would receive all the blessing and all the inheritance. And if the firstborn son was married and died before they had a child, then the second son had to sleep with the widow of his brother and give her a child. And that child would not belong to the second son, it would be the child of the first son. And we see that whole drama, played out in Judah and Tamar. The first son was everything. Past that, the second son was not even a person. The third son, you can't even begin to speak. Not a person at all. David was the seventh son, the last in line in such a scenario. He was the lowest of all his brothers. And what was his job? To be a shepherd. The lowest of the low. And that is how David describes his God. Knowing full well, knowing exactly what a shepherd means, he says, God, the Lord, is my shepherd. And it's not only David. Many great people of faith in the Bible viewed God as a shepherd. It begins as early as Genesis. Jacob blesses his sons and reminds them that they were blessed because of the shepherd who is the rock of Israel. Solomon follows in his father's footsteps when he writes that the words of the wise are given by one shepherd. Isaiah says that he tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young. And the prophet Micah calls on God to shepherd your people with your staff, the flock of your inheritance, as in days long ago. The New Testament as well is full of shepherd language, shepherd references. As we mentioned before, Jesus considered himself to be the shepherd of the lost sheep, the one who would chase after just the one out of 100. But he wasn't just any shepherd. Jesus refers to himself as the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. I am the good shepherd because I know my sheep and my sheep know me. God was a shepherd for his people. That is an image that we see played over and over through the Bible, that God will go low. This is how low our God will go to save his people, to be with his people, his beloved children. So when we say Emmanuel, Emmanuel meaning God with us, it means that God came all the way down to be with us, all the way down to be with us in the dirt, into the smelly parts of human life. God came down to be our shepherd. He chose to be with us because he is the good shepherd. But for David, the really important thing was not just that God was a shepherd or that God was the shepherd, but he uses the possessive. He specifically says, the Lord is my shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. And it seems like a very small difference because a lot of the Old Testament authors, as we saw, wrote about God as a shepherd, but none of them said God is my shepherd. They said God is a shepherd. They say God is the shepherd, but David says God is my shepherd. My shepherd. This kind of intimate language had never been used before regarding God as a shepherd. It meant that God was not distant. God was not far away. God was not unreachable, but he was close to David. My shepherd. Not the shepherd of the universe, of the cosmos. Not the shepherd of this galaxy. Not the shepherd of the world. Not the shepherd of this region, the ancient Near East. Not the shepherd of Israel. Not the shepherd of my tribe or even my family or even my brothers, but he is my shepherd, my own shepherd. Personal and familiar. If we look at the rest of the Psalms, David often refers to God much more impersonally. You'll notice that God is referred to as inhuman because David says God is his shield. God is his rock. God is his fortress, his strength, his shelter, a tower, a joy, a support. All of these different terms. Even when David uses human titles, you can see the distance that David leaves, because he says God is a king, God is a judge, God is a helper, God is a deliverer, a great God. But here in Psalm 23, David says that the God of all the heavens and the earth, of the entire universe, he is my shepherd. My shepherd. This is the story of our God, who is close and personal and familiar and intimate. My shepherd. It is my shepherd who makes me lie down in green pastures, because he is close, because he is by our side. There's a book written by a man named Philip Keller about Psalm 23, but he approaches the psalm from a very different perspective, because Philip Keller is not a famous pastor, he's not a famous theologian, he's not a famous scholar. He grew up as the son of missionaries in Kenya. But instead of going to seminary, like a good MK should, he didn't go to seminary, he didn't become a pastor or a theologian, but he studied agriculture, and he studied wildlife management, wildlife preservation. Philip Keller was a professional shepherd. Sounds a little funny, but even today there are professional shepherds, right? The wool that we use for our clothes comes from these professional shepherds. So Philip Keller was a professional shepherd, so he wrote this book on Psalm 23, and he entitled it, A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. It was Psalm 23 through an actual shepherd's eyes. And regarding this verse, he writes that sheep do not lie down easily. We think that sheep will just do whatever you tell them, but sheep also have a will of their own. And he says, sheep will not just lie down wherever you tell them to. Actually, they are very picky. They're peculiar. They're 예민해, right? So for the sheep to lie down, he says certain requirements must be met. So when David says God will make us lie down, it is a very big statement. And he outlines the 4 conditions that sheep must have met in order to lie down. He says, first, sheep are very timid. They scare very easily. So they will not lie down unless they feel totally secure. They will not lie down if they are afraid. Second, he says, sheep are very social animals. So they are very sensitive to interactions inside the flock. So he says, sheep will not lie down if there is conflict between the sheep. Can you believe this? If there is conflict between the sheep, they will not lie down. There must be peace in the flock, harmony amongst the flock. Third, he says, sheep will refuse to lie down if they are being bothered by pests, such as flies or other bugs. They must be clean of parasites and diseases, he says, for them to lie down. And fourth, he says, sheep will not lie down if they are hungry. I can relate to that very well. Sheep will not lie down if they are hungry. They must be well fed in order to lie down. And he says these 4 requirements must be met for the sheep to lay down. Now, Keller may have earned a degree in wildlife management. He was a professional shepherd, learned in a modern school, but David already knew all this. David learned in the fields and the valleys and the mountains, the peaks of Israel, how to be a professional shepherd. David knew these truths very well. He knew what the sheep needed in order to lie down. So as we read these words today from David, we read from a David who knew exactly what the sheep needed, and yet he could say that God will make the sheep lie down in green pastures. So that is a hope for us who read these words, that our God will meet these needs, these 4 needs and much more. That God will give us security, that the peace of God which transcends all understanding will guard our hearts, will guard our minds in Christ Jesus. Our God will give us harmony in relationships, because when the Lord takes pleasure in anyone's way, he causes their enemies to make peace with them. Our God is a God who heals, Jehovah Rapha, who purified the water for the Israelites and promised them, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you, Jehovah Rapha. Our God gives us daily bread. For man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord, as Jesus quoted from Deuteronomy. Our God knows all of our needs and all of our concerns and provides for them. He meets them so that we may lie down in green pastures. Our God is with us even in the darkest valley. Amen. Even in the valley of the shadow of death. You might notice that both versions are used. In the NIV, if you look at the footnote, it says the valley of the shadow of death, even though the version printed is darkest valley. And I want to just think about darkness a little bit, and then we'll finish our sermon. But what is darkness? What is a shadow? What does it mean? How do you define darkness? Darkness actually has no meaning of its own. Darkness has no meaning. If we look at light, obviously we can see light. But if we look at light as a property, as an element, light can be measured. Have we thought about that? Light can be measured actually by many things. It can be measured by its intensity. It can be measured by its direction. It can be measured by frequency and wavelength and even speed. We know that light has a speed. Light can be both visible and invisible. Light can give off radiation, it can give off heat, and it can even give us energy. We know that the solar panels that we are creating receive light energy from the sun. But it is something that the plants on our world have been doing for millions of years. It is something that we even receive vitamin D from the sun. This is all the property of light. This is what science has told us about light. Not from the Bible, but science has told us that light has all these qualities. But what about darkness? What qualities does darkness possess? Darkness has no qualities. Darkness cannot be measured. It cannot be described even without mentioning light. Because darkness is defined by science as the absence of light. The absence of light. It does not have a definition of its own. Albert Einstein said, darkness is in reality the absence of light. Light we can study, but not darkness. We can use Newton's prism to break white light into many colors and study the various wavelengths of each color. We can study light, but you cannot measure darkness. A simple ray of light can break into a void, into a world of darkness, and illuminate it. Darkness is nothing. Darkness has no power. It has no quality. It has nothing over light. Darkness may appear invincible at times. Darkness may appear impenetrable, but it has no power over light. That is the reality of our world, of our created order. That is what our science tells us, that God has created it like this. Light has complete power over darkness in the end. So what is a shadow then? A shadow is even weaker than darkness. A shadow is one small space, where the light has been blocked. Just one small space. It is a tiny piece of the world where the light is not shining at the current moment. That is the definition of a shadow. This past week, I had the opportunity to visit Gangdong-Gu Palace. It was my first time there. I enjoyed it very much. And of course, any visitor to the palace, you have to visit P1, the secret garden, right? The corner by my house in New York had a P1. It was a barbecue restaurant. So I didn't know what P1 meant until this week. P1, this secret garden. It was so beautiful. And it was amazing to see all of this history, right? Hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of years of history and the natural beauty of this site, right? It's one of Korea's World Heritage Sites. And standing just outside Daejojeon, the Queen's living quarters. If you go right outside, there is a sundial. It's from the Joseon dynasty. It's called Angbu-ilgu, right? Angbu-ilgu, a sundial from the Joseon dynasty. It tells the time, it tells the date, and it even tells the seasons. And I looked into it a little bit. It was originally constructed by the famous engineer Chang Yong-sil. I heard he had a TV show, right, a couple years ago, Chang Yong-sil, and it was at the command of King Sejong, the Great, Sejong Taewang. And I looked at this and I thought, what an amazing piece of technology based simply on the movement of the sun. That's all that it is. It just takes the sun's movement and measures it. And when I look at the sundial, it has a truth within it. And the truth within that sundial is the same truth that we find in Einstein's theory of darkness. It is the same truth that we find in David's Psalm 23. That the shadow can only move based on how the light moves. It has no power, no will of its own. It is completely at the mercy of the light. That is why John tells us that Jesus is the light of all mankind. He is the light of all mankind, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The devil, our enemy, tries to convince us that he owns the darkness, that he is the master of the darkness. He convinces us, makes us believe that shadows belong to him, that the shadows are his territory, that he has carved out this small corner of the world where he is the master, where he reigns supreme, where he has power. But the truth of the Bible is that we do not need to fear the darkness. We have no fear of the darkness. We do not have to be afraid of the shadows, because we know that when the light shines, the darkness moves out of the way. It makes way, it vanishes, it disappears. Any of us here who might be walking through a valley of darkness today, a valley of the shadow of death. I don't know what your valley is, but we all have one, or maybe we have multiple. Let us believe that our God is a light that shines even brighter. That our God is a light that shines into that darkness, that illuminates every little corner until there are no more shadows left. Because when the light comes, the shadows get out of the way. The shadows move, they disappear. So I encourage you all, let us read these words of Psalm 23. Let us read this psalm and sing this psalm. Let us recite this psalm and memorize this psalm. Let us internalize this psalm. Let us write it on our hearts, as the Bible tells us, because it is a psalm for the living. It is a psalm for us today, who can confess that the Lord is my shepherd. So let us pray.